Human civilization is threatened by climate change, extreme pandemics, supervolcano eruptions, and nuclear war. But what if prevention of these global catastrophes fails? Hi, I'm Matt, Research Director at Adapt Research, and in this talk I'll cover material that I presented at the 2024 Cambridge Conference on Catastrophic Risk, and hopefully you'll learn something about the ways to govern this kind of major threat. I'll talk about our year-long NZCAT project, which considered nuclear war from the perspective of New Zealand. But why focus on islands? Why New Zealand specifically? And why nuclear war? Well, islands can resist some global catastrophe due to special features like isolation and a moderate climate. For example, during COVID-19, islands, here in blue, suffered much lower mortality than non-islands, or even eliminated spread of the virus. Non-island success, here in red, tracked traditional health security capabilities, but island success, in green, turned more on border controls and elimination strategies, the sorts of things you might use to combat an existential biorisk threat. Islands are likely to suffer less from nuclear winter, and did in fact suffer less following the 1815 Tambora volcanic winter. Islands harbour 10% of the world's population, and they export food that feeds hundreds of millions of people around the world. And New Zealand is often cited as a potential refuge for humanity from existential risk, a place that might ensure that at least some humans survive. However, New Zealand is highly vulnerable to trade and supply chain collapse. Nuclear war represents global catastrophe, with likely widespread death, destruction, disruption, climate impacts, and resilience to nuclear war probably helps with a range of other catastrophes. So across a one-year period, we developed a hazard profile for the risk of Northern Hemisphere nuclear war from the perspective of New Zealand. We validated this hazard profile at a multidisciplinary international workshop. We conducted scenario-based qualitative expert surveys and an interview study. We reviewed government strategies and wrote technical papers. And we produced a main report, submissions to the New Zealand government, blogs, presentations, and a webinar with panel discussion. Our hazard profile, which outlines the likelihood and impact for New Zealand of a nuclear war between Russia and NATO, assumed widespread infrastructure destruction, possible electromagnetic pulse effects in the Northern Hemisphere, and a moderate nuclear winter. The day after the combat, key locations might resemble Hiroshima in the photo on the left, while there may be few immediate effects on non-combatant islands like New Zealand. However, severe disruption would be on the way, affecting fuel supply, energy, communications, payment systems, access to spare parts, climate and food production, and there may be social and economic disturbances. So we built a picture of the connections and interdependencies between a deteriorating global geopolitical context that gives rise to nuclear war and the ensuing severe disruptions to New Zealand's systems that supply basic needs like water, food, shelter and transport. When considering how to supply basic needs in the likely context following a nuclear war, we heard, through interview and survey study, that energy supply would suffer from loss of fuel imports and from loss of imports of spare parts. And New Zealand, 100% dependent on liquid fuel imports, needs an improved fuel response plan. Transport could fail due to a loss of global shipping and low shipping and rail capacity locally in New Zealand. But electrification, improved planning and cooperation with Australia could help. Communication is at risk from destruction of international data centres, undersea cables and satellites, and New Zealand needs a digital communications continuity plan. Food production and distribution is also at risk from a breakdown in the supply of the industrial inputs required by agriculture. And this is critical because New Zealand exports food that feeds tens of millions of people, and this depends on liquid fuel. Interviewees told us, if we don't have diesel, there's no way to get back to doing it with horse. There's no machinery to do it that way. I do not think that the transport sector in New Zealand is at all well equipped to organise itself without the internet. We don't have enough people that understand what they are using. Most organisations have little to no experience in-house, referring to a critical dependence on global digital providers. And we heard solution ideas too. It may be that there is a need to focus after a catastrophe on harvesting just required produce and on the most productive land to conserve fuel. And a working group should really be set up to develop a national food security strategy. New Zealand could put in place a coordinated national digital communications continuity plan, with respondents noting that New Zealand has not tested its digital systems in the absence of global internet. So what can be done? Well, we quantified some key factors, including export food calories, food consumption, the highest yield frost-resistant crops, and fuel use in agriculture, and we ran some optimisation calculations. At present, food production in New Zealand consumes nearly 300 million litres of diesel for on-farm uses per year. But we found that for 5 to 15 million litres of fuel, you could feed everyone, and this fuel could be produced locally as biodiesel. So how could it be done? Well, this square represents the land area used for current dairy production in New Zealand, 1.7 million hectares. This is the land area for wheat production, and this is potatoes, just as 3 example crops. This is the land area of dairying needed to feed the New Zealand population annually if you were just producing dairy products. If you were only growing wheat, you would need this much land area to feed the population, and only potatoes this much. Potatoes use less land, but they are not frost resistant in the case of a nuclear winter. If you were only making dairy, you would need to grow 32,000 hectares of canola to provide a biofuel feedstock to produce biodiesel to run the required machinery. If you grew potatoes, you'd need 9,500 hectares, or wheat, just 4,500 hectares of canola feedstock. So this sort of analysis can help identify optimal crops to pivot to after a catastrophe, and therefore what kinds of preparations are needed ahead of time. Here's another example. This is Palmerston North, a globally median-sized city in New Zealand, with a population of just over 90,000. If fuel and transport are scarce, how much food could a city like this produce locally? Well, we identified 730 hectares of potentially arable land within the city. This could feed 20% of the population with efficient urban agriculture crops such as peas, sugar beet, or spinach. And you would need just over 1,000 more hectares in close proximity to the city if industrial high-yield crops like potatoes were sown nearby. But you would also need another 110 hectares of canola to make the 130,000 litres of biodiesel needed for the industrial equipment to farm the potatoes. But the cropped land could follow a transport route, such as an electric railway or river. And this kind of analysis shows why land use and land zoning could be critical local government policy issues for global catastrophe resilience. We also analysed New Zealand's risk governance systems. The present New Zealand risk management system deals with natural hazards and malicious threats to New Zealand, such as terrorism. But New Zealand is vulnerable to risks that originate elsewhere and spread to impact the entire world. To deal with these risks, new structures and relationships are needed. Ideally, there would be a systematic, publicly facing national risk assessment and risk register that included global catastrophic risks, and that would then inform a set of sector strategies and a critical infrastructure program for resilience and response. Our research also identified the value of a commissioner or chief risk officer to ensure accountability. And we stressed the importance of underpinning legislation and international coordination on cross-border risks. So turning to the impact of our project. Well, following our submission, the New Zealand Productivity Commission included a box on global catastrophic risks in their report on improving economic resilience. We also wrote to the Minister for Energy, and we were able to present our work to the National Fuel Security Study team. We emphasised the GCR Global Catastrophic Risk lens, and we were invited back for more. There has also been popular media coverage helping to nurture a public discussion, And although we can't claim or prove any direct link, UN delegates for New Zealand and Ireland are now tabling a UN resolution on the effects of nuclear war and scientific research to try and understand these first and second order cascading impacts from a catastrophe like nuclear war. So this work can be distilled into a few key messages. We've looked at New Zealand specifically, but islands are important as home to 10% of the world's population, as major food exporters, and as natural existential risk refuges. But islands are vulnerable and need strategies for mitigating global trade collapse. They need anticipatory governance to help prepare for destruction, not just disruption, to critical global infrastructure. So, the NZCAT approach is transparent and documented and can be replicated by other islands and for other risks. And we've shown that a year-long program can attract the attention of government advisors if regular high-quality content and events are targeted. We now have a new organisation, Islands for the Future of Humanity, to progress this work, and you can go to islandfutures.earth. So thank you for watching this video, and I hope you learned something about global catastrophe and resilience options. But if you want to know much more, then click the links in the description below for our hazard profile, fuel and food technical papers, and our main report. Or click to watch our 90-minute webinar presentation and in-depth expert panel discussion.